All right, thanks, Joel. So yeah, as Joel said, I'm an automation engineer at a company called Blue Nation. I'm also a board member of the nonprofit Association for Software Testing. Hopefully you've seen our small logo on the slides in the intermission. But we're super happy to sponsor the OTC. I've been here before as just a participant as well as a speaker, and I love the fact that we can do these things from conferences basically from anywhere. I do occasionally speak at conferences and meetups. I write regularly at Kenst.com, which is my website, and a few other places around the web. And I also created and maintained an open source list of software testing conferences from around the world at testingconferences.org. So if you ever get a chance, check that out. All of the materials for this presentation are actually available on GitHub. And so this is a QR code. If you have the chance, go ahead and snap a photo of that, and you will be able to get the slides, get my contact information, get a few references, that kind of thing. Everything basically about the presentation, including a copy of the slides, will actually be on this repository. You'll also find a link there if you want to go the old-fashioned way. But yeah, as Joel said, I've been in software quality for 15 years. And so as a part of that, that's meant that I've worked at big companies, I've worked at small companies. Most of the small companies have been at startups. That's generally my preferred place to work. And I've also worked all over the stack in terms of whether it's on the front end, on the back end, testing all over. But most of the companies that I've worked for have been related, have been in building web software as opposed to desktop software or mobile devices. It's basically been about web. And so when I'm going to share my experience when I started looking for a new job about this new role, the automation engineer that I interviewed for. And so I'm going to go over a little bit of my background as well as my path to getting here and what that looks like. And I'm hoping that this experience will be helpful for anyone who's like, hey, I've heard of that, but I don't know what it entails. And so this is what it entailed for me, both getting there, what it is now, and sort of what it is in the future. And I hope that serves as a really useful data point for you. And by the way, I'm sorry if there's some background noise. Hopefully there's very minimal of that, but I am in a public spot because my Wi-Fi did go out at home, which is just lovely. So hopefully everyone is at least generally familiar with the test automation pyramid. That's not what's on the screen necessarily, but if you are in general familiar with the testing or test automation pyramid, you know it's a pyramid. At the bottom, you basically have this group of this large block for unit tests, and then in the middle you have some like integration tests, and at the top you have UI tests. And the whole idea behind the automation pyramid is that you should have a minimum number of UI tests, or a small number of UI tests, a larger subset of integration, and a large number of unit tests. This is actually my favorite version of the automation pyramid, which is the automation bug filter. Sorry. This is by Noah Sussman, and he basically flipped the automation pyramid on its head, and he described it as a bug catcher or bug filter. And here you can see you have at the top an infinite set of possible known bugs. And then basically you have these sets of tests, unit, integration, end-to-end, and exploratory tests that catch those bugs. And the reason that I like this is because the way I started out in testing was I started out on the bottom, doing all the exploratory testing, all the human testing, that kind of stuff. And then I slowly moved up this pyramid to start writing end-to-end tests, automated end-to-end tests, to catch bugs there. And in fact, there's a coworker here at the company that I started to work, basically where I started my journey on that, at a company called Dr. Evidence. And so the main takeaway is that you can find bugs, we can catch bugs as a part of the development process at all these different layers. And then from a development perspective, what you really want to do is you want to be able to catch them as early on as possible. So you want to have a large number of unit tests because they're really small and really easy to run. They provide really quick feedback. And then as you sort of go along, you want some integrations, you want maybe a little less than your unit tests, you want to have integration tests, and then you want to have less end to end. And then hopefully the most subtle bugs that you're finding are due to the human exploration. Now, personally, I've never worked at a company where the bugs that I found as a human tester were the most subtle. In fact, they were often the most obvious bugs. I was working at a startup at the time that was delivering really complex software. And that was the thing. We kept delivering software to our users, to our customers that had really obvious bugs in them. And as testers, we were catching these bugs. But by then it was really too late and we couldn't hit everything. So I needed a way to become more effective in that role. I wanted a way to catch more of the bugs. And so here's sort of my confession is that I learned to write code and to build UI automation. And the reason that I say that this is sort of my confession is because it's not a great way to start. If you look at that bug filter, you think back to it, you want to start catching things at the unit level. And then if you can't catch it there, you want to catch it in the integration. And then finally, you want to catch it sort of on that UI end-to-end level for your automated tests. Well, I started catching things I started working my way up the pyramid as opposed to working way down it, where I started catching things as an explorer. And I said, well, there's got to be a better way to catch things than exploring. And so I started writing UI tests. And the simple fact is that writing UI tests, automating UI tests is sort of a well-worn path. Everyone is pretty much familiar with Selenium. There are a few other tools out there that do similar things. But if you want to learn that stuff, there's a lot of resources to help you learn. And it's a lot easier if you are an explorer, a former explorer, to start writing UI tests than it is probably to start writing integration or unit tests, even though that may have more benefit. So my background was I started learning how to program in Ruby. I used Codecademy, Code Wars, a number of different tools to be able to learn to code. So this was about 6 years ago. I didn't have any previous programming experience. And I was like, I'm going to learn how to use Ruby. And I wanted to learn how to use Ruby because I heard that it was relatively easy to use and to learn. So that's what I did. I also bought a book called The Selenium Guidebook by Dave Hafner. And I basically went through that entire book. I went through all the examples, tried all the examples myself, and then I reapplied all those examples to my company's problems. And that turned out to be a huge learning curve because when you take someone's examples built for an example simple application and apply it to your complex application, you learn a whole lot, mostly about what doesn't work and some of the assumptions that were built into that. So I was constantly trying out, and I'd made time at my company to dedicate to doing this kind of stuff. But I started, and I was writing my code in Ruby, which is a code Ruby was not used in the company at all. And the reason that I did that was because one, that was what I was familiar with. And two, I wanted to get on the ground running with it. But the downside in hindsight was that basically shielded me from getting any type of feedback from my developers within the company. And so in hindsight, it wasn't great. And I didn't learn that until I actually moved on to the next company where I also built another UI framework. Luckily, I joined a company where the company itself was a Ruby-based shop. And it turns out if I'm a Ruby programmer or I have programming experience in Ruby and you join a Ruby shop, there's lots of people that know how to program in Ruby. Fantastic. So I started getting feedback from my developers on, hey, this is the code that I have. They started to sort of up my programming experience, my complexity, and they just basically started providing me feedback on what I was doing. And so this sort of just goes home to the point where like the more I practiced, the better that I got. The other thing that I want to sort of call out is eventually, once I joined a company that used Ruby, I was able to get code reviews. I've heard a lot personally, and maybe you have too, that when you should always treat your automation code like it is production code. And I know when I started learning how to write UI automation, I did not do that. And I really wish I had, mostly because I missed out on ways that I could learn and become better myself, as opposed to, oh, I was really afraid that someone was going to say something. No, every developer that I worked with that offered to help me do code, offered to do code reviews, they were all there to sort of help me get better. And in fact, I'm a really big advocate of testers getting involved in code reviews. Even if you don't program, learning how to read code can be super beneficial. I recently gave a webinar on this, and I just think that if you're on this presentation and you're a tester, you should try and participate in code reviews, because there's a lot of possibilities for you to learn about code changes, learn about all kinds of different stuff. And so, like I said, I learned to program in Ruby. I used the Selenium guidebook by Dave Hafner. Moved to a company that used Ruby, got some code reviews to help me get better. And that was really great. That gave me a lot of confidence in my abilities, and it helped me level up my abilities as well. Eventually what happened is I started looking for other jobs, and mostly because I got laid off, which happens sometimes, especially when you work for startups like I do. They tend to be a little bit more volatile. And so I started seeing a job called an automation engineer, which is a job that I now have, but I didn't at the time, and I started interviewing. And the thing that I came to find out real quick is it was a coding role. It required some level of coding, because obviously you're now going to be, as opposed to what I was before, which was a QA engineer, where I would do exploratory testing primarily and then some automation in the background. This was like, hey, you're gonna probably be mostly doing coding along with some testing. So in terms of the coding bar, it's not nearly the same as a software developer, or probably even a software developer in test. I had to do some basic code challenges, mostly in an interactive IDE during an interview, like in CoderPad. It was something that was relatively straightforward, like FizzBuzz, which is basically just looping through and passing some variables and printing some lines. It was very, very simple stuff. I was also, when I was doing these interviews, luckily, also being interviewed for a testing role. And I don't know about you, but I've interviewed places for testing roles where they've never given me a testing challenge or a testing interview question, which is never a good sign. But when I was interviewing for automation roles, they definitely gave me a coding challenge, and they definitely gave me a testing challenge, which is really great. The other interesting thing was that for this role called an automation engineer, is the pay scale was better. The pay scale was better than comparable roles for just QA engineers. In hindsight, I'd like to say that the difference between what I do now and what I did then, not a whole lot different, but I am definitely happier that it pays better. The other thing I'd like to call out is, because I was mostly interviewing for automation engineering roles with web technologies, that just meant any question around web tech was possible. So there was a lot of questions around APIs and REST, what do HTTP codes mean? How do you test something? All that kind of normal stuff. I eventually joined a company, as Joel called out, called Bloom Nation. I joined them as an automation engineer, and I've been there for a little over a year now. So Bloom Nation, if you go to bloomnation.com, we're actually a marketplace for flowers. If you are in the United States, at least, you can put in a zip code, and we will match you with a local florist. And then you can purchase one of their beautiful handmade floral designs. Our big business, though, is we actually reach out to those florists, we bring them onto our platform, and then we actually launch them an e-commerce site and handle all of their e-commerce transactions. So Bloom Nation itself is actually an e-commerce company. When I was brought in, my first job was to recreate a targeted set of UI automated tests. One of the first things that if the first thing you learn is an automation pyramid, Then the second thing, once you decide that you're going to write some UI automation, is what your strategy is going to be. And so the strategy should always be a very targeted strategy. For an e-commerce company, it actually makes a lot of sense. You want to be able to hit your business critical systems, which for us as an e-commerce is ensuring that we can collect customers' money. So that was my first assignment. It was my CTO, my boss, was basically like, you need to create a set of UI tests that make sure we can continue to collect people's money. Fantastic. And so I joined, I started doing that, and I'll take a minute to sort of say, when I joined, when I was interviewing, I asked them if they used Ruby as a programming language, because that's what I had familiarity with in the past. And they said, no, they didn't. They basically we are a PHP shop and a JavaScript shop. And so I had this question in my mind, you know, I told them, my CTO, when I was interviewing, that, listen, I write in Ruby, but if you give me the time, I'd actually like to learn how to program in JavaScript. And I think that would actually be better for the company. I always go back to whether or not the programming language that I write should be the same as the one that the company uses. And now I can tell you, having done this a few times, there are massive benefits to writing your test code in the same code that your company supports. I had previously said that code reviews are very important. And so the big thing is that if you write in a language that your company doesn't support, you won't be able to get code reviews. The second thing is that means that if you leave that company, no one will be able to support the work that you've already done. And that's what happened for Blue Nation. They had someone who wrote UI automation code in Java. No one in the company used Java. They left, and the code and tests all became stagnant. So I told my boss, I was like, listen, I would like to learn JavaScript because that is something the company does. And then that way I can get support from anyone else. And then you will have tests that someone else can support if I were to ever leave. And so that's what I did. In addition to working on UI tests for our e-commerce checkout, which are essentially scenario tests, I also created a bunch of automated tests for SEO, search engine optimization. This is a really big core part of our business, is making sure that all of our sites are understood very well by Google. And so we have a bunch of tests in place that check the elements of a particular florist's website to make sure that our tags didn't break, which would, of course, cause a devaluation in our Google search rankings. There's lots of stuff on here. I have started working on API tests. I've written a few unit tests in PHP, but that was not a fun experience. I do a lot of code reviews. We're a small company, so I do a bunch of production support, and I do a lot of exploratory testing. The whole point of this list isn't to sort of brag, but it's to show that I joined the company and I knew that there was going to be some automation involved, and I knew that there was going to be some exploratory testing involved, but I actually worked on a lot of things. Production support and monitoring. I'm involved in all the deployments. I'm also involved in configuration changes related to our CI pipeline and any kind of process improvements that might happen. So this is sort of just a snapshot of the things that I've worked on within the last year. And this is, of course, very, very high level. The other sort of things that I ask is, or get asked often or think about is, how much time in this automation engineer role do I actually spend automating, and how much of that time do I spend exploring? And so as far as I can tell, just sort of based anecdotally on my looking back at my notes, of the time that I actually spend testing, about 60% of that is probably around automation, either doing like writing new code, maintaining existing code, doing something around a specific task, writing some regular expressions, any sort of code command line kind of stuff. And then the other 40% is probably exploring. These aren't hard and fast rules. These are just sort of, they vary at times. For example, right now, our company is working on adding the ability to support QuickBooks for our florists. That basically means right now I'm in 100% exploratory mode. So that means I test big features that are high risk to our business, and that my CTO is like, listen, I need you, Chris, to take a look at this because we're really concerned about it. And it should come as hopefully no surprise to people with experience, even if you don't have experience with automation, that automation by its very nature requires that you explore. Hopefully it's well understood that you have to explore, you have to test, and you have to understand your application before you can really automate any of the processes around it. And so I know this is sort of not talked about, especially when we start talking about automation and building tests, but you really do have to be able to discern what is a good test, when should you do this, are there other ways to get around it? And that means that you have to actually spend time yourself going through the application and making decisions and constantly questioning things. So that is basically what I do. At Illumination, basically what I'm working on, 60-40 split kind of between automation and exploration. That's what I've worked on at least in the last year. In the next 6 months, I will continue to do that same thing, but the cool thing is I'm going to be working on a new greenfield application. When I was talking about automating our e-commerce checkout, that was an existing application that was already there, has been around for a long time. And so I basically used a combination of JavaScript and WebDriver IO, which is a Selenium bindings version of JavaScript, to automate our checkout flow for different browsers, for cross-browser testing, as well as for mobile. When I switched to our new application that we're building in-house, the upside is I will actually be able to more closely embed myself with my developers and hopefully be able to create a much more targeted, much smaller, lighter integration of our UI tests for this new application. And hopefully what is sort of ideal for me, what would be a big win, is if I could actually build that and then hand that off to my developers for them to continue to build out and maintain. One of the things that I'm not concerned about as an automation engineer is I'm not concerned about someone else doing the automation. I'm not concerned about anyone else helping me out, whether that's my developers or some tool. I actually see that as a big win that helps us accelerate our achievement of shippable quality. Shout out to any of the modern testers or A/B testing podcast listeners for that one. Some of the challenges that I have just right now with being an automation engineer is, one, we get a lot of data and customer data and analytics, which is good because I can start to make decisions on what I automate. But it's also sometimes a little bit overwhelming on what we should do with that data. The other challenge for me is that because I'm probably a 60-40 split between coding and exploratory testing, that means that I essentially need to, in order to continue to get better, that means I need to increasingly spend more time actually programming and becoming a better JavaScript programmer, become a better software developer, as opposed to spending that time, say, doing more testing and getting better at testing. It's for sure a challenge. And it's one that I'm, at this point, not entirely sure how I'm going to deal with, but I know that that's something that I'm going to have to address. The other cool thing is that our company is starting to play around with machine learning, and specifically machine learning around being able to identify and categorize our products. So I can see in the near future, probably in the next 6 months, us having a product that is using machine learning, and that hopefully, I'm saying hopefully, that I get to explore and try and test. And there will probably be some automation in that as well. I'm just sort of not sure what that's going to look like, but it's on my radar. So now, as we sort of start to, I've talked about a little bit about how I got here, my background, what I'm doing now. We just discussed some of the challenges. A few more of the challenges that I see is that Um, I'm trying to make decisions about what's best for the short term versus the long term. I am within my company being the sole automation engineer. It also means that I'm essentially the sole tester. I'm not in a development position. I'm in this quasi role. And so that actually means that I am trying to coach and become a test coach for my developers to try and help them level up. Since I can't spend time on everything that I want to in terms of hands-on exploratory testing, that means we actually rely a lot on our product managers and our developers to do feature testing. And so that actually leaves a big opportunity for me to try and coach them as best as I can to understand and help level them up in their testing. It's a big challenge, and it's one of those things that I'm not really sure how well I've done yet, but I know that I need to keep doing. So let's talk a little bit about the future of this role. And Joel, how much time do I actually have? I think I've got another 10 minutes or so.
Officially, you have another, let's say, 13 minutes.
Okay.
But if you're very interested, I will let you move and then just pass the questions to the Slack channel. So go ahead. I'll stop you if needed be.
Yeah. So I have just a few more slides, and then actually one more slide, and then we'll do questions, because I see that a bunch of people have questions, which is fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about.
Just touched a nerve, I guess, on half the people in the audience, so it's okay.
That's fine. So let me talk a little bit about the future. And so let me call out right away. I'm a little concerned about the future of this role. And I will say this as someone who both pays attention to the A/B testing podcast where they call this out, but also just in terms of what I see. So as I said, I'm now at Bloom Nation, been there for over a year. I'm learning how to program in JavaScript. I built one UI framework in JavaScript for our let's call it our legacy application. And then I'm going to be deploying probably at least one more for another part of our application. But here's the thing, I'm getting code reviews from my JavaScript people, from my front-end devs. And the thing is like, they pretty much all get everything that I'm doing. And so I'm sitting in this role going, actually, you know what? Most of the stuff that I'm doing, the stuff that I'm automating, to be fair, the stuff that I'm automating, it is all stuff that they could do if they had time to do it. Now, there's definitely some question about how much time that they have. And part of the reason that I'm in this role is that the developers themselves have just not had time to be able to deploy this kind of stuff. But I see that as sort of not a great linchpin for myself, that the reason that I exist is because someone doesn't necessarily have the time to do it. Especially as I start coaching my developers, and I sort of mentioned this in the previous slide or previous two slides. One of the things I'm hoping to do on our new Greenfield project is actually deploy a UI framework that my developers themselves can maintain. I think about that because I see so many synergies if we can both work on something, as opposed to just me, myself, contributing the vast majority of the time, and then my developers contributing once in a while. It goes a long way to getting them to better understand what the tests do and to contribute. And then, of course, to know what to do with when they see failures and that kind of stuff. So none of this, and then the other thing that I want to call out is I hope everyone has heard of the book Accelerate. There's this great book by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and one other person that I'm missing, called Accelerate. And it's basically about how companies are able to accelerate their development processes, big and small companies, how they can sort of better work to deliver better products, better quality products. And so the book actually calls out a section on test automation. And so they did a bunch of research. I think they went into several hundred companies. A third of the book Accelerate is actually dedicated to just the material and the research that they did, but they call it out and they say it's interesting to note. I know I'm reading my slides, which is bad presentation, but it's that important. So it's interesting to note that having automated tests primarily created and maintained either by QA or outsource is not correlated with IT performance. And so you can, and then the third line is, I'll also call out, first, the code becomes more testable when developers write tests. This is one of the main reasons why TDD is an important practice. It focuses developers. And then the last line is second, when developers are responsible for the automated tests, they care more about them and invest more effort into maintaining and fixing them. So this kind of stuff calls out to me that, one, this is different than having testers. Accelerate will actually say, listen, we don't advocate getting rid of testers with a testing role. That is very valuable. But this goes to this idea, this clouded idea that I have about the future of this role, which is I'm actually not sure what this has in store. Because if we think about it from a management perspective, and if IT performance is correlated with developers writing automated tests, then that basically lops off, I'm not kidding, that lops off 50 to 60% of this role, at least as I do it. So that's, not to throw doubt into you, but these are the questions that we want to think about. None of this is hard and fast. I know that this is an increasingly popular role, so it's entirely likely that the vast majority of the industry won't recognize this kind of stuff. As we've seen as testers just in general, there are pockets of the world that move a little bit quicker than other ones do, but it's one of those things. You start to think about when you get into a role, how is it going to advance? How do you get better at that? And sort of what's the value of this role in the future? And I'm sure I see some questions piling up. So Joel,
as I said, man, you actually touched the nerve, and it was very nice to see how you're giving a very good preamble to the MT presentation we'll have tomorrow. So just a shout out for around this time tomorrow, we will have Alan and Brent speaking about MT. So MT as in modern testing, guys. If you haven't heard of it, you need to be here tomorrow. But let's actually start going over the questions. And by the way, just before I go over the questions, I just want to shout out something that you said that I think it's incredibly important. People miss it out. And that is the part where you just said that testers doing code reviews.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a very big myth, and I think that there's a very big problem with testers that they think that coding is kind of hard, where actually it isn't. And one of the easiest things to understand is if you have a logical sense and you can follow a process, it's going to be very easy for you to do a code review. So I echo what you said as many times as possible and tell testers, go ahead and do a code review. It's an incredible tool for many, many reasons, but I'm not going to go into that right now. I just recommend it. So, definitely. Man, there are tons of questions here. I'm just going to go over in the order and try to pick up the ones that are there, and I apologize because I'm sure we won't be able to go over all of them. Sure. First question, very early on, you had the pyramid on, and the question is a very good one. Okay, you talked about all sorts of functional testing and unit testing and stuff like that. Where does performance and load testing go on when you look at a pyramid? Have you ever thought about
that? So the automation pyramid is not about these. It's not about functional tests necessarily. Well, I guess you can kind of look at it that way. Where performance and load tests, they're not on there, at least in the versions that I've seen. If you want to sort of think about that, you could, like, load tests, depending on your application, load and performance tests are actually probably around the integration level. Hopefully you're not doing load and performance tests on your UI necessarily, but I mean that, so I guess the response is, the answer is, it really depends. They're not typically included in a test automation pyramid. There are lots of variations, lots of versions of that test automation pyramid. I would suggest someone else go and create one that does include this kind of stuff and get feedback on it, because I think that's a really good question. I don't know that I have an answer to that.
Okay, let's move on. And guys, I'm not going to be able to go over every single one of them, so sorry for that. I'm just picking and choosing, and the rest I will try to copy to the Slack channels so Chris can just digest them a little bit later on. So, man, you talked about Selenium, you talked a little bit about Java. People are always interested in just getting some names of tools that you like to use, I guess, as a reference.
Sure. So the tool that I use for our legacy application, it is called WebDriver IO. It is a JavaScript implementation of the Selenium WebDriver bindings. And so I use that. I write in JavaScript. I use WebDriver IO. I use Mocha.js as the test framework. There's more stuff that I'm forgetting. But that's the big stuff. In terms of the new Greenfield application, I haven't settled yet on a tool, but there are a lot of JavaScript testing tools out there.
Cool. And again, I'm sure that people can continue asking, and I'm sure they will. Okay, here's an interesting one. Okay, so I'm an experienced tester, and I'm embarking on a program of self-study in order to transition into test automation. What would you recommend as the most important areas to emphasize? Is it coding, unit testing, APIs, UI, backend? Where should this person actually start?
You need to start with coding because you need to be able to write some level of code. You're going to have to pass. So, again, it really is going to depend on the role that you apply for. But you can definitely see for an automation role or a junior developer role or any of that stuff, there's going to be some coding that's required. Even in testing roles, and I don't agree with this, but I've been talking with a lot of people of late, especially in the United States, and especially around the LA and New York markets. Increasingly, recruiters, even for testing roles, QA engineer roles, it is increasingly common to find that they want people who can automate stuff. And so sort of by definition, that is going to need some experience with tools, automation tools, and the better that you can get at coding, the better chances you are going to be able to automate stuff. Because it's not just about automating at the UI, it's about automating at any stack. Any of the level in the automation pyramid. UI, integration, unit, that kind of stuff.
Okay. I think that you answered a little bit, but people kept asking it. And the question was whether, okay, let me reframe it because you actually said yes. And you said that it's better to automate on the language that the application is being written. But can you comment again on why is that the case? Why is it important? Why is it better when you're writing the automation on the language that is written?
Well, so I didn't say that it's better to write in the language that the application is written. I said it's better to write in a language that the company supports or the company has.
I stand corrected.
Yeah. No, it's fine. Or I hope at least that's what I said. So essentially, and this goes back to being able to get feedback on your work and to get code reviews. If you join a company and you know Python and the company doesn't know Python, but you've been hired to do some automation, then okay, do it. But the challenge that I had when I did that was it meant that no one is going to look at your code. Probably no one is going to look at your code. And that's a huge missed opportunity because that means you are going to have a real trouble going to your developers and going like, hey, this is my test code. And remember, your test code needs to be in getting to production quality. Like you need to be writing production quality for your test code. You don't want to be writing just a bunch of junk. And the way that you get that code to production quality is you get code reviews and you get feedback from more experienced developers. And if you write in a language that your company does not have, does not use and does not support, I say use and support interchangeably here, then you're not going to get that. And then that means your code is going to probably be bad. Or it's at least reliant upon you to get better to improve your code. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think it did. Okay, this is an interesting one. Hope that you can actually bring some into it. When and where do you think it's better to start to set up a deployment strategy for tests, especially if there's no strategy at all, not even for developers?
A deployment strategy for tests? Is that what the question was?
Yes.
Deployment strategy for tests. I'm not entirely sure what that means.
I guess that again, I would even link it to a testing framework. Meaning, a lot of people do start writing test cases and you run them, and maybe you link them to some sort of CI. But when do you think that you need to start saying, hey, you know what? Let's actually put together a good testing framework that not only will it run test cases, will bring reports, will help to link the whole process together. When do you think that it's a good time to do that?
So when you start to, going back to that bug filter, if I'm joining a development organization, they're like, hey, we're thinking about when we should start to get into like UI automated tests. I would say once you are comfortable that you have sufficient unit and integration tests, because if you go back to that bug filter kind of thing, you want those other things caught earlier on so that there's faster feedback and it's easier to fix them. You want those UI things for when you can only catch UI related bugs. So when you're starting to think about the strategy of when to start doing something, you sort of want to follow that progression. You want to go like, what does our unit test coverage look like? Should we actually spend more time and effort there, or should we move to this other area? Because it's always going to be about, for management, it's always going to be about whereabouts they're going to be able to place resources and get the biggest sort of investment or payoff for their investment.
Okay, sounds good. Another one that actually comes from your experience here, and this person actually is struggling with this. They say, how do you balance between writing new test cases versus maintaining and updating the existing ones, since you're the only tester in your team?
Yeah, so this goes back to code quality. You should not spend very much time maintaining your test cases or your automated tests. So I don't spend very much time at all. And that's just something you have to pay attention to. So one of the things that we do is we use Jira. All the things that we work on are related to stories in Jira. So if I have to make a code change related to maintenance on my automation, I will create a story and then I will work off of that story and commit my code that is seen and attached to that story so that I can go back and go, oh, and I would actually probably file a bug on something that is related to maintenance. Like, oh, this locator no longer works. Oh, this no longer works. And so over time, you can start to see how much effort you are putting into that kind of work. And again, hopefully it's not a whole lot. My UI automation is actually fairly maintenance free. Like most of the stuff that I have to do is actually just interpreting what happens during failures and taking a look at that and making a quick decision about whether it's actually a failure or not.
Okay, and man, I think that again, there are a number of additional questions. Maybe I will try to copy them, or you can also look into the Q&A and just shift them over to Slack. But as I said, I think that you touched on a nerve based on the number of questions that people are having, and that's great, because I guess that you are talking about something that is very close to everyone's heart, and that's, again, great talk to listen to. So man, thank you very much for being here.
And I just want to say too, that for everyone that has a question, you can put them in the Slack channel. You can also just ping me on Slack and I will literally have a conversation with every one of you. I'm not kidding. And we can talk about this kind of stuff if you have follow-up questions, because I know for myself, like having a support group is really important to sort of dive into that kind of stuff. And I'd love to be there to be able to help you. And the great thing about the online test conference, and we have a Slack channel, so I can do that. And I would be more than happy to answer detailed questions to all of you.
Excellent, man. So again, I think that people will take you on your word and do that. And once again, man, really, really happy to have you here, and thanks for being in the sessions.